Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, we're back with another tier list, and today we're talking about the best structure decks ranked from best, or all of the structure decks, ranked from best to worst, specifically in the TCG, and just kind of their influence in the metagame, as well as just how good they were as structure decks, or releasing new cards, or reprints, or anything of that nature. Okay, to be fair, this isn't technically all of them. It also includes the 2-player starter decks and some other things. But this is, for the most part, what we need to know. So, all of the ones that actually matter. We also have a way to look at all of the structure decks here. So we're going to start off here with White Destiny, which I believe is this one, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. Am I wrong? No, this looks right. So Blue Eyes White Destiny is an extremely good structure deck. I'm going to put it in S tier. It revitalized the deck, giving us new cards like Maiden of White, Spirit Dragon, Wishes, etc., while also giving us some fairly decent reprints in this form of like Valor and Nibiru and Seal and Called By and Infip and Ash, and just an insane structure deck, solidly S tier. Right. Next up, we have the Fire King one, which is just structure deck Fire King, which is SR 14, which also gave us a bunch of other additional new cards. Things like Ponix, things like Kieran, things like new Garunix, things like Skyburn, things like Sanctuary. All of these are very, very powerful cards for the Fire King strategy, and once again, also revitalized the deck, making it a top tier meta strat. Let me see it. There it is. So a very solid overall structure deck. I'm going to also put that one in S tier. I think both of these are like the examples of what we want in structure decks. On top of that, we also got some fairly solid reprints. Not like the best, but like some fairly decent ones, right? Solemn Judgment, Tenki, Dark Hole, Torrential Tribute, again in Perm, right? Stuff like that. Droll and Lockbird was reprinted as well. So lots and lots of solid cards overall for Fire King. Coolio. Next up, we have the structure deck for Crimson King, which I believe we have on here. We do. And this one was fairly decent as well. While it didn't have the same meta relevance as the other two that we've talked about, it does, in fact, have a solid smatterings of success. So overall, the Red Dragons are not terrible, but the overall impact that this had in terms of the metagame was not nearly as felt. However, it was a nice revitalization of an archetype that had kind of fallen to the wayside, as well as it kind of printed some decent cards, like Pot of Extrav, Backjack, the Dangers. But for the most part, like, the staples weren't great, which is, I think, why I'm going to put this one in B tier. I think it's not terrible, but, like, in terms of a structure deck on its... Actually, I'm going to put this lower. I'm going to put it in C tier, because I think I'm going to put it in C tier. The problem is, like, while it was good for the archetype itself, it didn't actually provide anything outside of that, even within, like, the metagame or within just, like, reprints or something like that. It wasn't necessarily something you wanted to pick up just as, like, a general player, right? Unless you specifically wanted to play this deck and specifically wanted the cards to make that deck playable, you probably weren't buying any of these structure decks. So there's that. Next up, we have Beware the Trap Tricks. I'm also going in reverse order, and Beware the Trap Tricks. I actually already know a lot that is in here because I bought it a bunch, but this is a very solid one. Again, some solid reprints, but not insane. Some Kaijus, Raigeki, Harpy's Feather Duster. Obviously, the Trap Holes, Ash Blossom is a notable inclusion in this one, and then of course Evenly Matched as well, which is also very solid. So again, some solid staples, and Trap Tricks was actually fairly okay with the new support, right? Giving them the new support with Arachnocampa, as well as Pudica and Trap Tantalizing Tune, Garden, Holitea, etc. A lot of these cards are fairly solid. However, again, didn't really change the metagame, didn't really shake up a whole lot, and was fairly decent by itself, and was solid for the reprints. I'm going to put it in B tier, maybe A tier. I might move it up, but we'll see where else everything else goes. But for the most part, I do think that Trap Tricks is fairly solid and is kind of like a baseline structure deck for what you want. Coolio. Moving on, we have the Dark World structure deck, which again, new cards for an old established archetype, pretty solid in what we end up getting overall. Things like Genta as well as the Graph of Fusion are very, very solid. But like the rest of the cards aren't exactly great. Things like Skill Drain aren't exactly exceptional. in the current metagame and weren't exactly staples. All of the rest of the staples are kind of mid. And sure, the deck was playable, but it was never really meta relevant, similar in nature to like Red Dragon. A better example is like Trap Tricks, where it's like it showed up occasionally in top cuts and stuff like that. But due to the lack of staples and due to the lack of real staying power that this deck has, I'm going to put it also in C tier. That seems like where it should go. This is the wrong... Is that the right one? Is that the right structure deck? Did I? Hold on. No, that is the right one. Okay. I didn't know if this was the old one or the new one. I'm going to put it also in C tier. I think you could argue it goes in B tier as well, but due to the lack of staples, I'm going to move it down one. Moving on. We have the Legend of the Crystal Beasts, which is the Crystal Beast structure deck, which has cards in it, technically. Ash, Ghost Bell, Cyclone, Shifter, fairly solid reprints. And the rest of the Crystal Beasts, you know, they exist, let's be honest. I feel like I can't put this lower than C tier, but for the most part, it was not exactly exceptional. So we're going to put it in C tier. Albaz Strike is probably one of the most iconic structure decks in modern era. It gave us Branded, and Dear Lanta Branded was off to the races almost immediately. However, there are some notable inclusions that make this even more powerful than just like giving us Branded Fusion. We also got Valor and Ghost Ogre and Called By and Pot of Extract and Dark Ruler, which I know was very helpful. We got some more Kaijus. We also got Teekboo, which is a very funny card to include in this, as well as some other random cards in here, like a bunch of the Dragon support, you know, the Dogmatica cards, some of the Dogmatica cards, some of the Spriggan stuff. So lots and lots of really solid stuff in here. And with the inclusion of this structure deck, you could literally just buy like 3 of this structure, show up to a local, and probably do fairly well. If not, like, straight up win with just 3 of the structure, because of how powerful Mirror Jade in particular was at the time, as well as I believe Branded Lost, which was also in this set, so it was fairly solid. Wasn't like the greatest in terms of like non-engine and stuff like that, but it had enough to allow you to kind of continue playing and still play the game. You still even had things like kits to allow you to do that as well, so insane payoff and a very, very solid structure deck. Moving on, we have Cyber Strike, which is, I believe, the first one that I started buying, and this was a pack. This one had Imperm, which was fairly nice. It has Gale Dogra, which is like one of my favorite cards of all time, and kind of nothing else. Like Kanadia's kind of a staple if you squint sometimes, occasionally, but for the most part, like, it was just Imperm that was a staple. So not really great in terms of reprints. I guess like Fusion Deployment now you could argue is a staple. So, you know. But even that was kind of mediocre. And Cyber Dragon didn't really receive anything too noteworthy. Like, Chimera kind of helped. It helped shore up the weaknesses, and you know, it definitely helped the deck more than it hindered. But nothing really changed the way that the deck played or made it significantly stronger or anything like that. For the most part, I do want to put this in like D tier, but yeah, you know what? I'm gonna put this in D tier. I think it's really kind of such a mid structure deck, right? Sure, like, obtaining the cards is nice. And to be fair, none of these structure decks are bad. While I am putting a structure deck in D tier, that doesn't mean that it is a bad structure deck. It was still probably worth the, like, $10, especially in comparison to just, like, buying packs or even buying individual cards. So it's still a big boon in terms of buying that specific archetype or building a deck around said archetype. But that being said, in terms of a structure deck, it's definitely one of the weakest ones that we've ever realistically seen. One real staple with no real good archetype synergies, right? And the fact that it also was technically 2 different strategies in one. There was no XZ, right? So it was just the bad fusions and nothing else. Like, you didn't have it Infinity or anything else of that nature. So you're just kind of like stuck with a middling go second archetype with no real go second cards. It was very bad. It was just not a good structure deck. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Next up, we have ourselves the Freezing Change, which I believe is Ice Barrier, which did give us some fairly decent Ice Barrier cards. Most notably, the new... Oh, is this not the new Synchro? This was released in 2021. I'm lying to you. This is not with the new cards. So, with that in mind, Yeah, no, this didn't do enough. This was another really bad one. I don't think this was a great structure deck. We had like Crackdown, which was okay, Pointer, which was you know, a card at the time that did stuff, but for the most part, I guess the frogs are like staples, right? Ronin Tonin, Dupe Frog, stuff like that. But yeah, the Ice Barrier one as well, I'm gonna put into D tier. I really don't think this was very good. Even with the new support, like, it didn't do anything for the deck. The deck still died to the same things. And while, sure, it could technically do more, it's not until Lancia comes out that this deck actually has plays. So there's that. Next up, we have the Spirit Charmer deck, which was something, and did give us cards that do exist. Most notably, this is, I think, one of the first times where it got one of the hand traps reprinted. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is one of the first times where, like, in a structure deck, we got a card that you would want to buy 3 of the structure decks for, which is Effect Veiler. Effect Veiler is pretty solid as a card. But there's also a few other things: Book of Eclipse, Twin Twister, Dark Ruler, Solemn Warning, Raigeki, kind of. But the structure deck itself is so middling in regards to what it accomplishes. Like, it didn't change the way that Charmers worked, right? All of the Charmers were extremely bad. The new support was not great. Like, it really didn't do anything. It's another really bad one. I'm gonna put it in C tier just due to the fact that some of these staples are actually fairly decent, right? Dark Ruler, Twin Twister, Book of Eclipse, Effect Veiler, Raigeki, right? So there is, like, a reason to pick up this structure, and there is some merit to buying it. But even then, I'm like, it probably belongs in D tier. Anyway, we're going to move on to our next set, which we have ourselves Sacred Beasts, which is the new Sacred Beast support, which I'm not going to lie, this one is pretty bad. Yeah, I mean, just look at this set and tell me what in here is worth playing. This is... okay, I will say, it is a massive upgrade from what we previously had for these 3 beasts: Raviel, Uriah, and Hamon. So that's not really, but that's not really, like, saying anything, because they were terrible to begin with, and now they technically have an Arc deck. However, if we were really looking into the future, technically, if you had purchased this structure deck, you would be more set for when Yubel came out 4 years down the road, right? 5 years? 4 years down the road. So, like, technically speaking, it's kind of a good investment, because you're getting things like Opening, you're getting the Chaos Summoning Beast, you're getting the Chaos Dark Beckoning Beast. But other than that, it really isn't great. And I'm not going to say that, hey, Future Sight makes this a really solid set. I'm going to put this solidly in D tier. I feel like there's not much more that you could say that makes this better. Next up, we have Mechanized Madness, which gives us the Machinas, which notably gives us Citadel, which is such an insane card for Earth Machine that I genuinely feel like I can't put this that low. It also gives us the reprint of things like Machina Fortress. Actually, yeah, this is a reprint, right? Same thing with, like, Scrap Recycler. Gives us things like Trap Tricks and Cyclone, and a few other notable cards as well. Earframes in here. So for the most part, I would say that this is a fairly okay set. Not the greatest, not the worst. I'm going to put it in C tier. Where is it? There it is. It's almost entirely carried by Citadel. Like, Citadel is such an insane card that getting access to that card now off of the structure deck is way better. There you go. Next up, we have Shaddoll Showdown, and this is such a very, very, very solid structure. I lied to you earlier when I said the Cyber Dragon was the first structure I bought. This one was actually the first structure that I bought 3 copies of. I had forgotten that this was in fact the first one, but this was a very, very solid set. Getting access to Shaddoll Fusion, all of the Shaddoll Fusion monsters, including all of the main deck monsters as well, adding additional cards in as well, like Lava Golem, the Envoy, Dark Arm Dragon, even Electromagnet Turtle to send to the grave as a light was fairly solid. There's also Trick Clown in here. We also have things like Lost Wind and Super Polymerization and Twin Twister in here as staples, which, again, at the time was fairly solid. This was back in 2020, right? We didn't have nearly as much need for a myriad of hand traps, so adding an additional non-hand trap variant staples was also very solid. So I'm gonna put this one in A tier. I don't think it's S tier, but it's damn close. It's very, very good. It just like accomplishes everything that the deck wanted. I don't believe it printed any new cards. No, it did. It printed Schism, if I'm not mistaken. I am mistaken. Schism was not in this set, so there's that. I think there were new cards in here. I don't know which ones because it's been a while, but I just remember this actually coming out, and it was. I don't think it was meta at the time because Construct was at 1 or something else along those lines. So that kind of made it a little bit worse. But I do remember you were still able to like buy 3 of this and more or less do well at locals. So that was pretty cool. Next up, we are going to look at the Rocket Revolt, which is the Rocket structure deck. Which actually, is this on this list, or do I need to put it on there? I do not see. Am I missing it? Maybe. Hold on. No, it's right there. Okay, it just has Zeraboros as opposed to Rocket card, so I got very confused. But overall, Rockets do have some fairly solid cards. Imperial Orders in here, Red Reboot, which was a staple at the time. Obviously, Quick Launch and the Rockets themselves were staple, and like continued to be staple cards for Dragon Link for quite some time. Boral Load was such an insane card, right? As well as Boral Load Furious, which later down the line, as well as Zeraboros later down the line, became fairly solid. But you know, disregarding those, we still have things like Twin Twister in here, Return of the Dragon Lords, Dragon Shrine, and then of course the actual Rockets themselves, which were all fairly solid. I don't think this one gets to that same peak that some of the other S tier ones, as well as even Shaddoll gets. So I'm going to put this one in B tier. I think it's very good, and it was a very good set, but it wasn't something that was like truly worth that much investment unless you were specifically playing that archetype. However, that archetype was very, very solid, which makes it a little bit more advantageous, right? Next up, we have Order of the Spellcasters, which was Endymion, which has, again, a fairly solid Endymion package, of course, including things like Droll, which is something because it's a spellcaster. Terraforming is in here. Pot of Desires is in here. There's a few things here or there, but this is a fairly weak structure deck overall. Yes, it is a fairly good archetype and was a fairly good archetype at the time, right? Endymion was like meta at this point in the life cycle of the game, right? 2019, right? So with this set, it became a meta threat. So fairly solid. I'm going to put this one as well in B tier. I think it was just due to its meta relevance rather than like anything else. Similar in nature to Rocket, because the rest of this structure is pretty mid. I'm not going to lie. I honestly kind of want to move it down to C tier, but I do think that it had enough staying power as an archetype to warrant this structure deck being worthwhile. Because if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't until like 2021 when they finally released Servant of Endymion. I could be wrong about that. So let me know. But also, like, Droll is in here, which is fairly solid, so there was still, like, a reason to pick it up. Sorry. Moving on, we now have ourselves the Soul Burner structure, which is the Salamangreat structure, which is the first Salamangreat structure, which not first, which is the Salamangreat structure that we get in... Yeah, that basically made this deck meta, like, overnight. This deck was so very good. Again, it was an idea of like you pick up all 3 structures, build a deck with just the 3 structures, show up to a regional style event and win. Like that, I believe that is a story that legitimately happened either with this or one of the other structures. And yeah, this is like an S tier structure, not due to staples nearly as much as it was just how powerful the deck was when it came out. Sure, getting Ash Blossom as well as like Gozen Match was fairly good, but just Salamangreat in general in 2019 was absolutely dominating and was genuinely one of the best archetypes of all time. Next up, we have Zombie Horde from 2018, which was another. It exists. Zombies have never really been all that competent. Competent's not the right word. Meta. They've never really been a good meta tactic, but they have been fairly decent from time to time, and the structure deck kind of shows that, right? There's nothing really too notable in here. Anti-Spell Fragrance, I guess, is the biggest thing there. I guess Foolish Burial as well. Monster Gate was not bad. There's a few things here or there. I guess Zombie World is like a fairly decent tech card in specific metas, but for the most part, there wasn't anything in particular that made this stand out above the rest. I'm going to put this in C tier. There were some staples. It helped the archetype, but it didn't really boost it to such a meta status that it was worth playing, and the staples weren't enough to really carry it. Next up, we have Power Code Link, which is just an abysmal structure deck as a structure deck. Now, that being said, it did give support for a myriad of archetypes later down the line, because Cyberse became insanely powerful. But with things like Flame Bufferlo, which would later be used in Salamangreat, with Lady Debug, with Cyberse Gadget, with, I mean, even Skullmeister and Forbidden Chalice and stuff like that are fairly decent effect veilers in here, right? There are some good cards, and, like, to be fair, this is 2018, links aren't exactly great, so Lampharinkus could technically be something of merit because of the link arrows, but there's really not much going on in this one. It is pretty struggling. Actually, I think I put the wrong one there, didn't I? I did. Okay, it's not, sorry, it's not that one, it's this one. Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's a pretty bad one. I mean, you can see. Of course, talking about at the time, right? Things like Flame Bufferlo, Lady Debug, and Cyberse Gadget were very, very strong. But at the time, they were not. So, not really worth it. Next up, we have Layer of Darkness, which is, of course, the Layer of Darkness archetype / structure deck, which was fine. Never really that meta-relevant. Kind of relevant. It did give us the viruses, as well as Rise to Full Height, which is stuff, right? Tour Guide reprint, which I believe had been reprinted at the time, so it wasn't all that expensive. I could be wrong about that. This may be the first time it was reprinted, which may have boosted it. But overall, outside of that specific thing, it's not really all that great. I'm going to put this one also in D tier. I could be wrong. Let me know on that one. Next up, we have Wave of Light, which is the structure deck for the fairies, or light fairy, like counter trap fairies, which gave us some decently good, okay-ish cards. We got Ava, which is a very good card. We also got Christia, which like kind of does stuff. We got some heralds in here. Notably, the Herald of Orange Light is also in here, which is something. But kind of nothing else. There's not really a whole lot going on with this. And this was in 2018. So this could have been significantly stronger and it would have done something. This is an Agents, which could have been like something of worthwhile. Or something worthwhile, right, at the time. Yeah, this one's also going to go into D tier. It's not a very strong structure deck. Not a bad one, but also kind of a bad one. Next up, we have Cyberse Link, which is from 2017, which is very early Link days. So, do keep that in mind, right? And we did get Dotscaper, which is fairly decent. Things like Mathematician, Card Trooper, Mindcon. Mindcon was crazy for quite some time. This card right here existed in this structure. We also have Cosmic, which is an insanely powerful card and has been since release. And then, we actually have some decent monsters, notably Trigate Wizard. We also have things like Binary Sorceress and the like. It's not an insane deck. It has some good cards and is not like the end-all be-all, but there were a lot of meta cards at this time that did come from this, most notably things like Trigate Wizard as well as Dotscaper, Mindcon as well. So some fairly good cards overall. I'm going to put this one solidly in B tier. I think it's a fairly good one. For the time, it was pretty good. And yeah, there you go. And now we finally come to our next, we're already on the next page. We now have Dino Smasher's Fury structure deck, which if you know how good this structure deck was. Oviraptor, UCT, Lost World, Baby Sarasaurus, absolutely insane for this archetype. And this was another deck that was pick up 3 copies, go to locals, and stomp their faces in. This was such an insane archetype at the time, and was extremely powerful, a lot thanks to things like Miscellaneous Source and Oviraptor just being insanely powerful cards in and of themselves. Sure, like Miscellaneous Source doesn't have its best target in the level 1 Animadorned Archosaur, which is a very, very powerful card, but this is a easy slot into S tier. I think this is a very, very solid archetype, or not archetype, very, very solid structure. Yes, it didn't print like staples nearly as much. Like, as you can see, there's basically none in here that actually matter. But just due to the merit of how powerful this structure deck was at the time, I think it can't really go lower than S tier. So there's that. Next up, we have Machine Reactor structure, which is the Ancient Gear one, which gave us cards like Reactor Dragon and the Roach. What? The Roach. Yeah, for the most part, this structure deck was not exactly doing it. It had some cards that were playable. You know, Galaxy Cyclone was fairly decent. You know, the Ancient Gears weren't terrible. Machine Dupe was a good card at the time. But overall, it really didn't do much to break Ancient Gear out of the metagame. So I would put this in probably C tier. I don't have it on here, I just noticed. But that's okay. We're still going to talk about it. I'd put it in C tier. There you go. Next up, we have Pendulum Domination structure, which again, I don't believe we have in here, but that's okay. We're going to talk about it real quick. This is a DDD structure deck, which was, again, fairly decent, but it didn't give us any of the actual support that really pushed... well, I guess, no. This was when DDD first started becoming a meta in 2017. So this was a fairly good structure deck, right? Giving access to Lamia, giving access to Orthos, giving access to Beowulf, which were all fairly decent, as well as Siegfried, obviously. Giving access to all of the contracts, which were also fairly decent, as well as some of the other staples in the archetype as well, which just allowed for you to kind of end on some of these very powerful boards. And this is where the first spreadsheets started to pop up with DDD. So overall, I will say that this was a fairly solid one. I'd put this one probably in probably B tier, right? Allure of Darkness is in here, but that's kind of it in terms of like, Foolish Burial 1-for-1, stuff like that. So there are some cards here or there that are fairly decent for the archetype. So there's that. We're gonna move on. We have so next up we have Yugi and Seto as the structure decks from 2016. So these are the ABC as well as the magnets. Which I'm just gonna say this. We don't have these on here as well. The magnet one is like D tier. This is so mid. There's like nothing in here that's worth noting. Like, oh, you're gonna activate Mirror Force. Whoop-de frickin' do. Who cares? There's nothing of merit in here. However, Seto Kaiba, the ABC Buster and the A Assault Core, B Buster Drake, and C Crush Wyvern were some of the most powerful cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! At that time. Union Hanger is one of the craziest cards that has ever been printed in any game, just due to the amount that it is able to accomplish off of basically one card, and is extremely solid at what it did. It was the best deck at the time. This is a very very easy slot. I was going to say clear and easy slot into S tier. ABC was just so dominant at the time. It was maybe not dominant, but it was clearly the best deck. And yeah, a lot of it was due to this structure deck. All right, moving on. Next up, we have Rise of the True Dragons structure, which was the Felgrand style. I don't know. This was like Chaos Dragon style archetype stuff. We got cards that exist. And none of them were relevant. This was there were some things of note, like Eclipse Wyvern, you know, the Collapse Serpent, Wyvern Burster, Red MD, stuff like that, you know. There were things, there were stuff, but yeah, for the most part it wasn't anything really of note. I'd probably put it in C tier. Next up, we have Emperor of Darkness, which was the Monarch structure, which this is another instance of buy 3 of the structure, show up to locals, and dominate. And a lot of that was off of the back of the insane Pantheism. Pantheism is such a powerful, insanely broken card that almost any other archetype would immediately just break this. But alas, Monarch didn't really have that. You also have things like Eruption, or Monarchs Erupt, as well as Domain of the Monarchs, and with no extra deck to begin with, you can just entirely lock down your opponent and just say, no, you are not playing the game, thank you for coming. It was a very, very solid at both going first and going second due to the insane power of things like Ether, as well as the Erebus to just break boards and establish your own, as well as all of the actual staple monarchs, things like Caius, things like Mobius, things like Grandmarg, all just very, very powerful in their own right. So all in all, just an insane structure deck, S tier. Moving on, we have ourselves the Master of Pendulum, which is the 2015 Pendulum archetype slash, I guess it's Odd Eyes slash Magician archetype or structure. It did give a Skulker Bat, which is nice, and a few other staples, things like Torrential, Trap Tricks, Trapple Nightmare. Pentacall was like good. So yeah, I'm just kind of looking for staples right now. There were a few things. Lina was like surprisingly competent at the time. Meteor Burst was a fairly decent one. All of the Pendulum stuff was like fairly decent. I'd probably put this one in B tier. I don't think it was like dominant by any stretch of the imagination, but was a fairly solid archetype. Oops, wrong button. We have Synchro Extreme, which gave us cards to synchro with, and they were fairly decent. They weren't great, but they were something. For the most part, I don't think this deck or this structure really provided anything. Yeah, 2015. Jet Synchron's nice. Scrap Fist is a card that exists. But yeah, this one's not great. There's nothing in here. I guess Valor is in here, which is nice. Plagues is in here, which is also pretty decent at the time. Or am I lying to you? I might be lying to you. But yeah, nothing really of note here. I put this one in D tier, like, pretty handily. Coolio. Moving on. I believe none of the rest of these are technically on this list. So we're just going to quickly go through these. The Egyptian God ones were fairly okay, if I remember from memory. Actually, I'm lying to you. They're D tier ones. The 2-player starter was fairly okay. It gave us what, like, I think like a Synchro, and most notably it gave us Zeus, which was fairly good. But for the most part, they weren't insane. And then both of these structures I do not actually know. But I do want to talk real quick about the rest of these. We're just going to quickly just talk about them. So we have Hero Strike here, which was the hero one with things like Dark Law. This was very good. I'd put this one in A tier. It gave us Dark Law as well as Shadow Mist, which was very solid for the time. It also gave us the Koga, which is, again, very, very good. And like the entire hero package as well, which was solid at the time and made Hero actually competitively viable. We had the Geargia structure, which again made Geargia like the best deck in the room. This was by far one of the best structures. I probably put it in A tier. It wasn't like a buy 3 and win the game, and it did. I don't think it provided any like notable staples. Maybe like Creature Swap or something else of that nature, but for the most part, this wasn't like an insane deck outside of just the meta deck. So I'm just gonna put it. I would say I'd put it in A tier. I could be wrong about that one. Realm of Light was very, very powerful, a very solid structure for the entirety of the Lightsworn archetype, and was a genuine boon to the archetype as well, and just like a solid meta deck. I don't think this was meta at the time. Actually, I'm lying to you. I might be. No, was this? Yeah, because we got like Raiden and Minerva and Michael. No, I don't think this ended up being meta due to the structure. So I'm going to put this one in B tier. It was fairly solid though. Next up, we have the Cyber Dragon Revolution, which gave us Core, which I believe. No, I think I'm wrong. I don't think this gave us anything notable except for maybe like Cyber Valley at the time. I could be getting my numbers mixed up. This is when things start to get hazy for me because I don't exactly remember this era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Too fondly, or too well. So it's more difficult for me to specifically say. I think this one was fairly decent. I would say it's probably an A tier one, but then again, I could be wrong. I don't remember how impactful Core was at this time, but it did give us Nova and Twin and stuff like that. So, actually, I don't think this one was all that competent. I'm going to put it in B tier. I lied. Next up, Saga. of Blue Eyes structure deck, which was kind of okay, but this was none of the cards that actually made Blue Eyes meta at any point. So I'm gonna put this one in like C tier, probably lower. I think C tier is fairly accurate. It did some stuff right, Champion's Vigilance, Fiendish Chain, etc. Fairly decent cards of consonance. But yeah, for the most part, not great. Then we have Onslaught of the Fire Kings, which was bad and not very good, and we're not really going to talk about it. It was bad. I'm going to put it in D tier. We have Realm of the Sea Emperor structure, which actually did provide some fairly decent cards in the notable Dragoons, which I'm sure all of you are aware of and know how terrible it is. And that was kind of it. There were a few other cards in here, but for the most part, you're not actually getting a whole lot out of these structures. I guess Torrential and Deep Sea Diva were fairly decent, but for the most part, it wasn't great. I'm going to put that one in C tier, but it was like, hey, here's Dragoons. We have Samurai Warlord, which was 6 Sam, which gave us the 6 Samurai Unite, 6 Samurai Dojo, Urshien's Dojo, and Gateway of the Six, as well as Smoke Signal, which was all very, very impactful. It did not give us the new, not the new, but the Synchro Monster, which is notable. However, it didn't need to. The rest of this was very, very powerful, most notably these 3 spell cards. And yeah, this is also Rivalry, which, hey. So yeah, for the most part, I would put this one in S tier. I think this one, yeah, I think this one is what made 6 Samurai like tier 0 for a second. Or like tier 1, right? Dragon's Collide structure gave us Light Flare as well as Light Pulsar, which both were fairly decent, as well as Eclipse Wyvern, and all of these were fairly decent cards. I mentioned Eclipse Wyvern earlier, but there, up until this point, Eclipse Wyvern wasn't really all that useful. So there's that. But the rest of the cards in here are fairly decent. Dark-Armed Dragon, Chaos Sork, Mystic Tomato, etc. But it's not like that great of a structure deck. It's fairly decent. Some fairly good staples. And then the light and dark dragons here are pretty good. But we're gonna put that one in B tier. I think it was pretty solid, but not end all be all. Gates of the Underworld were also very, very solid in terms of what you actually obtained. So for the most part, I would say that this is another like S tier. This is another buy 3 of the structures, show up to locals, absolutely dominate. This was such a powerful structure deck in and of itself. The Dark Worlds were very, very solid. Tragodia was extremely good. Sangan was fairly decent. Things like Mind Crush as well as the Transmigration Prophecy were fairly decent as well. And the list goes on, right? Very, very solid deck. Very, very solid cards. Moving on. We have ourselves the Lost Sanctuary structure, which was the Agents, which again was so very, very good. However, I don't think this structure deck in and of itself was as dominant as some of the others. While this deck was very solid and was the best deck at the time, I do think that it wasn't strictly due to the structure. That sounds kind of weird. I don't know. This one, it's hard to say whether Agents were actually the best deck in the room, or if it was just because of this structure being so readily available that everyone was playing this deck. So for the most part, I don't think that this was the deck itself being as good as it was, or if it was just people perceiving the deck to be, like the structure deck to be as good as it was, or like better than it was, basically. I'm going to put this one in A tier. I think it's pretty solid. Yeah. Next up, we have Dragoonity Legion, which was okay, and not really much to write home about. The Dragoonity cards never really did anything, and for the most part, I would put this one in a C tier. So, there you go. We have Merrick, the structure deck, which is a structure deck of all time, and is not very good, and I'm going to put this one in D tier. Lava Golems, there, but this was released in 2010, so bit late. Or early, I guess. Then we have Machina Mayhem, which gives us the Fortress and Gear Frame in the first instance of these guys, if I'm not mistaken. Or at least, like, around that time is when they were released. And they were so incredibly powerful, I genuinely want to put this pretty high. I'm going to say, like, A tier. This is a lot of, like, very staple cards, right? Dimensional Prison and Compoles and, Machine Dupe and Cyber Dragon. Very, very solid cards. Very, very solid deck. Warrior Strikes Structure, which was the no good, very bad warrior deck that existed, with like some cards that like kind of, Saku's in here and MST's in here, so those are like some fairly good staples. B tier, C tier. I'm lying to you. Spellcaster Command, Man, structures in the past used to be so ass. This was a 2009 deck with Breaker being maybe one of the best cards in here. I guess Giant Truenade's also in here, which is, you know, that was like fairly good at the time, right? And, like, Book of Moon is in here and stuff. Not a good one. D tier. I really have nothing for you. However, there was a special edition which also gave us Valkyria. Smile. Then we have the Zombie World structure deck, which was the first time we got the Zombie World structure, which was, you know, it was... For structure decks at the time, it wasn't terrible, and it did give us some notable cards like, you know, Spirit Reaper and Dust Tornado and Bottomless and Pyramid Turtle. But again, this is in 2008, not exactly 2004, which is when you would have expected this kind of stuff to actually be relevant. I'm going to put this one in C tier. Not terrible, definitely not good. The Dark Emperor structure, which was the first Monarch structure, technically kind of a little bit speaking, and also came out in 2008 and was fairly decent, right? It gave us the DDs as well as Dimensional Fissure as well as Macro, so it gave us a way to like play the Macro style Monarch tribute, which was okay. The problem is that they only gave us the one Monarch, which was Kaya's, which was such an insane card, as well as Kaiku, which was also fairly good. Also things like Nobleman of Crossout and Saku, but again, this is 2008, not exactly 2004. So I believe this is a little late to the party. I'm still going to put this one in C, B tier. I still think it's fairly decent for the time, but for the most part, it's not exceptional. Rise of the Dragon Lord structure, which this one did come out in 2007, and had some notable cards: Premature, Giant Trunade, Foolish Burial, Lightning Vortex, Morphing Jar, Dust Tornado, Saku. You know, these are cards that exist. Snipe Hunter is a notable card, but the structure deck itself doesn't really have a whole lot going for it. It is cards that do exist, and there are some fairly good staples. I'm going to put this one also in B tier. I wouldn't necessarily say that it is the greatest, but there you go. Moving on, we have Revolt, which was Ancient Gear, which was okay at the time, kind of. It gave us the gadgets and Heavy Storm. It's okay. I'm going to put this one in B tier. C tier? C tier. Dragon's Rage, which gave us Five-Headed Dragon, and some of the other cards in here. D tier. This one's bad. And then we have Lord of Storm, which was Harpies, which was a structure that didn't really accomplish a whole lot. It did. Yeah. I think all of these are pretty bad. I think every single one of these structures, I have heard like jack about every single one of these, so I'm gonna put all of these in D tier. We'll look through them real quick, right? Obviously, like, they have some staples, which is nice, but these were so readily available at this time that even now I'm like, I don't think any of these mattered. I don't think any of these structure deck staples mattered, because a lot of them were one-ofs and a lot of them were pretty readily available, if I'm not mistaken. Especially things like Heavy Storm and MST and Snatch Steel and stuff like that. Like, these were commons in a lot of sets that were not exactly difficult to pull, like, play sets of. So, for the most part, I don't really think that a lot of these are even worth mentioning, for the most part. It's not like, you know, Ash Blossom, where it was only printed in, like, one set, and then, you know, finally, a couple of years down the line, it gets a print in a structure deck. These are like, hey, we're printing these, and, like, everyone has these at this point. Maybe it's because of these structure decks that a lot of these staples are relevant, but almost all of them have similar staples, right? Pot of Greed, there's another Snatch Steel, here's another Premature, here's another Heavy Storm. I'm not really going to say that any of these structures are really that notable. Right. Most of these are probably just going to go into D tier. There's, like, nothing of note in here. I guess Thessalos, right? There's, like, a few Monarchs and such that are stuff. Fury of the Deep had... Gravity Bond? Yeah, it's just kind of like staples that all of these other ones also had. So, for the most part, I wouldn't necessarily say that any of these were exceptional, right? Or even really notable, right? As you can see. So, I'm going to call it quits there. This is pretty much the structure deck tier list that we have. A lot of really, really solid structure decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! And then a lot of really bad stinkers. You're just like, wow, these are just not at all worth the money. And there's very little actually in that middle. You know, not as much that I would say is, you know, sometimes worth it, sometimes not. But there's a lot that is like, buy 3 of this immediately. And then there's a lot that's like, buy maybe none of this at any point ever. I hope you didn't buy any of these. Anyway, I'm going to call it quits there. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy it. If you did, like us around my show. Appreciate it. And remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Button. I'm going to call it quits there. This is pretty much the structure deck tier list that we have. A lot of really, really solid structure decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! And then a lot of really bad stinkers. You're just like, wow, these are just not at all worth the money. And there's very little actually in that middle. Not as much that I would say is, sometimes worth it, sometimes not. But there's a lot that is like, buy 3 of this immediately. And then there's a lot that's like, buy maybe none of this at any point ever. I hope you didn't buy any of these. Anyway, I'm going to call it quits there. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy it. If you did, like us around my show. Appreciate it. And remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Button.